It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures: "Passion for God's house will consume me." But the Jewish leaders demanded, "What are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it." "All right," Jesus replied. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." "What?" they exclaimed. "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days?" But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said.
I'm so thankful for being the privilege of being a pastor here. And thankful for all those of you who I know you've told me you prayed for me, you encouraged me. I'm just so grateful for the people in this church who inspire me. Because when I look around and I look at the faces of the people here, I think this person prays way better than I do. This person's a better speaker than I do. This person has way more faith on more occasions than I do. And just on and on and on it goes. I'm so grateful for that because we need each other. And I have discovered that I need you. I want to take you back to the summer of 1988. How many of you old folks out there? Yeah, you remember this. It was a great summer. The Summer Olympics were on in Seoul, and the one event that was capturing the attention of most Canadians was the 100-meter sprint, the male 100-meter sprint. Now, I was 14 years old at the time, and I was excited about this because there was great potential that in this event, Canada was not only going to win the gold medal, but we were going to set a record for fastest man alive. There was great hopes on this young runner named Ben Johnson. Very fit-looking young man, wouldn't you say? And I remember watching them all line up. I was just glued to the set that day. And watching them all line up, and they were just focused, so focused. And then, bang! 9.79 seconds later. I don't think I breathed for 9.79 seconds. And Ben Johnson crosses the line first. Not only did he win the gold medal, he set the record for fastest man alive, 9.79 seconds. And I was so proud to be Canadian. It's like I had anything to do with it. This is the way sports work, right? When your team, when your person wins, you win. We take the credit. It's wonderful. But I'm sure for many of you, you know how the rest of this story goes. And I don't know how many days it took, but in days following, rumors started to happen, news stories started to happen, that Ben Johnson had failed the drug test and that he had taken steroids. And I thought, that couldn't be. It's Ben Johnson. He's Canadian. Canadians don't cheat. You know who cheats? Communists. They cheat. It was the 80s, okay? Give me a break. But it couldn't be a nice young Canadian like this who would cheat. And even when he stood up and he said, "I have never taken steroids," I believed him. Did I mention I was 14? I was even more gullible than I am now. But this race became known as the dirtiest race in history. Did you know that only 2 out of the 8 people in that lineup would finish their careers without failing a drug test? I had the wrong impression of Ben Johnson. And I'm sure you and I have both had wrong impressions about people in our lifetimes, have we not? People that we originally thought were enemies end up becoming friends. And people we were originally friends end up becoming enemies. It's just the weirdest thing. It's hard to really get a gauge on people. So you and I have had wrong impressions about people. But I think one of the people that people often have wrong impressions about is Jesus. And when people think of Jesus in popular culture, they think of
this good-looking guy, by the way, who, nice soft lighting, carrying a gentle, fluffy little lamb. That's the Jesus that most people think of. And they think he's probably such a nice guy, he probably let mosquitoes bite him because they got to eat too. And just like the breaking news burst my impression of Ben Johnson, this story will burst the impression many have of Jesus. If your thought is Jesus is just gentle and nice and kind, let's dive into this story. This is good. And by the way, you might be thinking, what does this story have to do with Thanksgiving? You'll find out by the end. Stay tuned. Here we go. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. This is one of the 3 times during the year that Jewish men had to make a trip to Jerusalem. Hard for me to imagine. This is a lot of travel time. But celebrating Passover, celebrating, of course, the Exodus from Egypt, where there was blood, the lamb's blood on the doorpost, and the angel of death, would go past those houses and all that sort of thing. So they're celebrating the Jewish Passover, and that's why Jesus is there. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Now Jesus walked into the courtyard of the Gentiles, non-Jews. And there, what he saw was pens of animals that were supposed to be in the marketplace in another part of Jerusalem. And they were allowed right there in the temple area. They made kind of a 7-Eleven. It was a convenience store. You didn't have to go all the way to a different section in Jerusalem. You could just do your shopping right there. You needed an animal to sacrifice. You needed to pay your temple tax. And by the way, the temple tax, which was instituted by the law of Moses, was 1/8 of a silver shekel. And everyone had to pay that. And you might think, that's terrible that you had to pay for that. You know what that works out to in today's dollars? 27.5 cents. It was a very, very tiny amount, but everyone contributed to the temple equally. And that could be a whole other message in itself, but we'll keep on going. Now, people's impressions of Jesus at this point are about to change. Here we go. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Now, some people have used this passage to justify violence. Interestingly enough, it never says Jesus actually struck anyone with that whip. But I don't want to downplay it too much, because this wasn't a polite way of getting people to leave. This was no Canadian, "Hey, could you please, if it's okay, if you don't mind, leave the premises, eh?" It was more like, get out now, move like you have a purpose, people. Imagine the horror on the disciples' faces, watching their moral leader start to flip over tables and scold people, causing a scene. How embarrassing. They're probably thinking, "Oh man, our leader needs sensitivity training. Maybe an anger management class or something." Maybe they were too in shock to stop him, but the wheels were turning, because we read this next. Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures: "Passion for God's house will consume me." This is a quotation from a song in the Old Testament, Psalm 69. And it's true in at least two levels. Jesus was clearly passionate about his Father's house, the temple, and it consumed his emotions. He got quite irate over this. But it's also true in a different way that we'll look at later. Right from the get-go, the not-so-gentle Jesus was ticking off the wrong people. It says, but the Jewish leaders, and there they are, the Jewish leaders demanded, what are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it. This is very much like that old, very tired atheist argument against Christianity. You know how it goes? Well, if God really exists, may he strike me down with lightning. Oh, I didn't get struck down by lightning. I guess there's no God. Lame. Very lame. But the Jewish leaders are playing the same game. They're saying, if you really have authority to do this, then show me. Thrill me. Prove it to me. Do something miraculous. And then Jesus does something really unexpected. He takes the bait, but on his own terms. All right, Jesus replied, I'm going to perform a miracle. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Jesus is saying, challenge accepted. I will show you the greatest miracle ever. Now, the religious leaders are taking Jesus very literally. The religious leaders, of course, are thinking bricks and timber. But Jesus is talking in code, as he often did. And prophecy, by the way, is often in code. And could it be that Christians sometimes interpret prophecy a little too literally? Nah, couldn't be. We might want to keep this in mind, keep this passage in mind, because these religious folks who knew their Bibles really well were missing the point entirely. What they exclaimed, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days. Now, the temple that was there in Jesus' time was called the Temple of Herod. And it was started somewhere around 20 or 19 BC, making the events of this story about 27 or 28 AD. And it wasn't complete yet, by the way. It was still being built. But it had taken 46 years to put all those bricks and all that timber together to make what was already there. And they're saying, wait a second, Jesus. It took 46 years for a whole team of people to build this, and you're going to tear it all down and build it all up in 3 days. Come on. Really? How do you plan to do that? Now, John, the writer of this biography, he's going to let us in on the joke, because Jesus is making a play on the word temple here. But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. So he's kind of letting the reader in here. He clues us into what Jesus is actually talking about. Not the physical temple in front of them, something far superior. Now, this is the key to the whole story. If you don't understand what I'm about to say, you're not going to understand the point of this story. What is the temple? The temple is the one place on earth that is a connecting point between heaven and earth. A place to meet God. You have to understand that. And Jesus is saying, I am now the new connecting point. I am the new meeting place, the new temple. And thank God, right? Can you imagine all of us having to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year to go to the temple just to meet with God? We take for granted that we could just pray at any time, anywhere you are. We don't have to travel to some place far, far away just to meet with God. Oh, this is good news. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. This, by the way, is more evidence that the Gospels are accurate. Because if you were making up a religion and you wanted to impress people with how holy you are, how knowledgeable you are, you would never include a detail like this. John is saying, yeah, we didn't get it. We were standing right there with Jesus, and we didn't get it. Could you imagine right now one of the candidates for U.S. president, as part of their campaign, standing up and saying, by the way, I'm a little slow. That's what John is saying here. We didn't get it. Jesus said stuff and we were like, what are you talking about? It wasn't until after, long after, we go, oh, I get it. See, you'd never put that in. Why would he add that detail? Unless that's exactly how it happened, right? Because of the miraculous signs Jesus did in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration, many began to trust him. Now, this is odd because in this story, we are not given miraculous signs. But it's like John is saying, look, he just did a bunch of stuff there. I'm not going to tell you about it. I don't have time. But Jesus was just doing his thing, okay? All right. But it started moving people towards trust. And now's the twist. As we get to the end of this passage, here's the twist. This is fun. Remember, the last line, because of the miracles, many began to trust in him. But Jesus didn't trust them. Jesus didn't trust them. Why? Because he knew humans. He knew us. No one needed to tell him what humankind is really like, right? So people started trusting Jesus, but the feeling was not mutual. He knew. He knew my heart. He knew your heart. Jesus never suffered with wrong impressions. He knows us completely and yet loves us thoroughly. And by the way, this is at every one of our hearts. We desperately want to be known completely and loved completely. But we'll often settle for one or the other. Only God can know us completely, right down to our motives, right down to our secret thoughts, everything that we think of, he already knows. He knows us completely, and yet he loves us thoroughly. This is so good. Now, the religious folks in this story, they wanted a miraculous sign. They wanted proof. And performing miracles can muster faith for a day. Many of us have been on religious highs before, faith highs. We've seen something, experienced something. It can boost our religious adrenaline for a moment. But what happens when the rush is over? What happens when you come back from summer camp? Right? What happens when the miracles dry up, when there is silence? What happens when Jesus no longer performs for us in the way that we want? What happens when he's silent? Will we trust him then? Will we wait for him then? And Jesus knew the answer. He thought, well, I could perform a miracle. But you know, throughout the Bible, performing miracles has had mixed results. Sometimes miracles convince people. Sometimes miracles don't convince people. And perhaps even though people were trusting him maybe as the Messiah, I wonder, were they trusting him as Lord? Many today hold Jesus in high regard, even as the worker of miracles, but they won't submit their lives to him. They have great regard for Jesus, gentle Jesus, wonderful guy, did some great things. They say, you can save me, Jesus, but just don't touch my family. Or don't touch my money, or my health, or my sexuality, or my security. You can save me, but just don't touch this area of my life. That's hands off. But for Jesus, the trusting to save always also meant trusting to lead. When it comes to impressions, we may get the wrong impression about Jesus, but he has an absolutely transparent impression of humanity. He knows that you and I, notice I'm including me in this, you and I are fickle and corrupt and looking for the next religious high. And we're often more interested in happiness than truth. And we're always wanting the next miracle as proof. And yet he still loves us. This explains, because he knew humanity and he didn't entrust himself to humanity, this is why, where did he keep going back? Who did he keep going back to? His Father. Because he could trust his Father. He knew his Father would never let him down. So, here's some takeaways to consider. First of all, and this is probably the most important, relationship is number one. If you remember anything from this message, my hope and my prayer is that this is the point you will remember. In the other stories where Jesus cleansed the temple, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it quotes Jesus as saying this is a house of prayer. And when Jesus walked into the temple that day, he heard clinking coins and bartering and bleating sheep and mooing cows and cooing doves and the smell of, well, you know, right? Everywhere. You can imagine. This is not an atmosphere for a conversation with God, right? This is not an atmosphere for prayer. This is not an atmosphere where people are going to repent of their sins and praise God and thank God. So much distraction going on. And like I said, there might not have even been space to pray, to worship. It's just animals everywhere, people crawling all over the place. Now, the money changers and animal sellers, in and of themselves, were not doing anything wrong, even though in the other accounts it refers to what was going on. Jesus referred to them as a den of robbers, so there was obviously some exchange things going on there, but that's another story. The relationship with God is top priority. The question is, was Jesus more concerned about the building or what the building was for? The temple was the meeting place of God and humans. It is a house of prayer. It is a house of connection, a house of relationship. The question now, and here's where it really hits home for us. Because if we insert ourselves into the story, the question for us is, does my behavior assist in your relationship to God? We often don't think about this. We walk into a group like this and we don't think anything. In reality, we think mostly of ourselves. Am I comfortable? Do I have what I need? Is the pastor entertaining me? Is the music good for me? Do I like it? We think of these things. But we don't realize that our words, our attitude, our posture, our consideration of others, our willingness to serve, our generosity or the lack thereof, our participation, all either contribute to or subtract from others' worship experience. See, Christianity is corporate. It's not just individual. So Jesus wanted people to know his Father, but the environment at the temple was terrible. The question for us is, what kind of worship environment are you creating? Places of worship should allow us to focus on God. Relationship is number one. And because relationship with God is number one, Jesus was willing to confront. Jesus was willing to cause a scene because the purpose of humanity was being threatened. You know what the purpose of humanity is? To know God and enjoy him forever. That's the purpose. That's your purpose. Yes, thank you. Yada. To experience God for all he is. And that was being threatened at the temple that day. To follow Jesus means we are willing to do whatever it takes to ensure people can meet with God. Relationship is number one. Number two, beware cultural Christianity. There's a warning for all of us followers of Jesus concerning the temple being called a marketplace. Because Christianity, for many, can become a means to an end. It can become a means to money, to friendships, to social status, to moral superiority. And we can surround ourselves with people who use Christian language, who read the Bible, they may have the same moral values, but they ignore the gospel. So instead, what we find is there are many people who call themselves Christians on YouTube or on TV, or who write books, or artists, or singers, or speakers, and they're not Christians. They're just in it for the money. They're cashing in on Christianity. So they'll sell whatever. You use these Christian books, t-shirts, candles, mints, stamp a cross on it and call it Christian and cash in. Am I doing okay so far? Okay. Beware the Christian marketplace when it becomes a substitute for authentic relationship with Christ. The trappings of religion and not relationship. Now, if you think I'm making this up, because I can tell that's what you're thinking, let's go to what Paul wrote to Timothy. He said, some people craving money have wandered from the true faith. In other words, they might have something that looks like faith, but their motivation is what? Money. That's right. Paul writes to Timothy in his next letter, and he says, in the last days there will be very difficult times, for people will love only themselves and their money. They will act religious. They will act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them change, make them godly. In Peter's final letter to the churches, he writes, there will be false teachers among you. They will cleverly teach destructive heresies. In their greed, they will make up clever lies to get a hold of your money. It's not like we're not warned about this. We are. Beware of health and wealth preachers. Many will teach us what we want to hear. That God just wants to give you comfort and safety and abundance. You won't need a family doctor. You just need to write a check and sow seeds of blessing. Clever lies. Clever lies. Beware of those who use the faith only to pad their pockets. Number 3. Jesus is exclusive. Jesus uses a lot of word pictures to describe himself. The door, the stairway, the narrow path, the gate for the sheep, and the temple. Jesus never suggests that there are other doors, other stairways, paths, or temples. And on the earth, there has always only been one temple to that point. One meeting place between God and humans. Heaven and earth, God and man. And Jesus is passionate about this. And what did he just communicate? He just said, I am the new temple. I am now the intersection of God and humans, between heaven and earth, the unseen and seen, the transcendent and immanent. And he did raise up this new temple. We understand the story, don't we? He did raise up this new temple. Yeah. And did you know, by the way, just for those of you who are, trivia people, did you know that the resurrection of Jesus is attributed to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? It was a team effort. I love that. I love it. Now, in the New Age teachings, which Vancouver Island is steeped in New Age teachings, they would say there are many ways to God. But Jesus is saying, I am the temple, I am the gate, I am the narrow path, the door, the way, the truth, and the life. Completely exclusive. Now, in logic, let's go to logic. In logic, there's something called the law of non-contradiction, which means this: that contradictory propositions cannot be true in the same sense at the same time. That's a lot of big words, but it basically means you can't be A and B at the same time. In other words, Jesus can't be the only way to God and be one of many ways to God at the same time. Somebody's lying to you. And someone's lying to the people that we love. And we may be the only people in their lives to tell them the truth. Jesus is exclusive. But was he authorized? You know, the religious rulers, they want to know, what gives you the authority to do all these things and flip tables and all that sort of thing? Because he rebuilt the temple in 3 days. He rose from the dead approximately 1,994 years ago. That is a historic fact, just as he said he would. Now, Jesus is so heaven-bent on you knowing the Father through him, he's willing to cause a scene. He's flipping tables. He's showing people a door. He's threatening them with a rope whip, scolding them publicly. God's entire mission was at stake. He looked around that temple and he saw people getting distracted. And it made him furious. Why? Well, Jesus is not so gentle, not so nice, not so accepting. You know, people often say Jesus accepted everybody. Tell that to the wide-eyed guys fearfully running out of the temple, leaving their belongings behind. But love makes you hate the things that hurt the people that you love. Love compels a person to act. Love compels a person to protect. Love confronts bad behavior. As I was writing this, a very sobering thought hit me. As I look out at all of you, I think, you know what? In 50 years, most of us will be gone. And where will that be? Where will we be in 50 years from now? Jesus showed here he is willing to do whatever he can to make sure that eternity for each one of us is with him. He's willing to upset the apple cart and make people mad. Why? So that you can come to him as the new temple. Because he loves you like no one loves you. This is why Jesus cared about the temple. Do you see his love in this story? This is not a holy temper tantrum. He wasn't concerned about a building. He was concerned about you. He loves you. He flipped tables for you. He drove people out of the temple for you. Nothing was more important to him that you know God. And that often happens through worship and prayer and contemplating his words, things that you would do in a meeting place between God and humans. People often miss the point when they read this story. Our faith is not primarily about rituals and habits. And the people there were missing the point in their worship of God. Faith in God is not primarily about rituals and habits. It is about relationship. It is about knowing him. It is about knowing him and enjoying him, both now and forever. So relationship with God through Jesus tops every priority. And we are to be, I'm summing up now, we are to beware of those who use Christianity for their own gain. And we invite people to follow Jesus because he is the only door, he is the only narrow path, the only gate, the only stairway to heaven, the only temple. There is no other way to be fully alive. Now, as we close, I'm going to close with this. Jesus is still willing to flip tables in our lives for us to know him, to connect with him, because his priority is still the same. He still wants you to know his Father. And he's willing to do whatever it takes, even if that means ticking off people, not being the gentle Jesus that people expect. Jesus looked and said, there's something interfering with the purpose of the temple. Something interfering with relationship here. This needs to change. And I'm so glad Jesus is the new temple, the new connecting point. And he says he comes and lives inside of us, which means we can connect with God anywhere we are. Isn't that beautiful? Oh, that's so, so good. Sometimes we don't like it when Jesus flips tables in our lives, right? Sometimes we can get pretty upset about that, but his goal is always the same. He has the highest priority of relationship, relationship, relationship. To know God and experience him. We are about to remember the cross. And if you are serving at the tables, please go to your table, but I want us to focus on this. I said that this verse would come back. Passion for God's house will consume me. It did consume Jesus. Jesus died on a cross so that you and I could have relationship, connection, worship, friendship, proximity, fullness, and completion. Jesus was passionate not about bricks, but about you, that you would know and enjoy God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Are you passionate about this connection for yourself? Are you passionate about this connection for others? Does it consume you? Let's not just remember what Jesus did on the cross, but why he did it. And here's the question that I want us to contemplate before we go to the table. Does your passion for Jesus, the new temple, consume you? He is the new temple. His passion for that connecting point consumed him. Does it consume us? Jesus is the new temple. Are you passionate? Does it consume your life? Does it consume your thoughts? Do you live only for him? Do you put him as the top priority in your life? I hope so. And I know for many of you, you have. You do. I can see it. And you encourage me. Every time where I'm kind of, down in the mouth or whatever, you're like, no, we got to keep living for Jesus. We got to keep putting him first. And I think, oh, yeah, that's right. I need that. And you need that. So before you get up, if you're a follower of Jesus, before you get up, ask yourself this question. How passionate are you about the new temple? How passionate are you? My prayer and my hope is that it would consume you. Every part of you. Every corner of your heart would be surrendered to him, to his purposes, and you would know him and enjoy him throughout the day. That is my hope. When you have answered that question, if you are a follower of Jesus, go to the table that's closest to you, and you will receive a cracker representing the body of Christ that was broken for you. You will receive a little bit of juice representing the blood of the new covenant that he shed for us. Go back to your seat and we will remember Christ together. If you are not a follower of Jesus, don't worry. I'm just glad you're here. And I hope that there's something in this message that moved you a little closer to Jesus this morning. That's my prayer. So, answer the question, go to the table, and we'll celebrate together. Today is Thanksgiving Sunday. And I said there was going to be a connection between this message and Thanksgiving. Did you catch it? Because we can be thankful for the new temple. Thankful, the New Testament makes a big deal of this. We now have access to God all the time. So we have so much to be grateful for. I am so grateful for the new and better temple. The Lord's table is a remembrance of the tearing down of the temple, right? It is the tearing down of the temple. And that temple had to be torn down because of my sin and your sin. The good news is that on the third day, that temple was rebuilt. And now you and I have permanent access to that temple. Oh, we have, above all people, reason to smile. A reason to celebrate and a reason to be grateful today. Jesus said, "Take and eat. This is my body." And Jesus said, "Take and drink. This is my blood of a new covenant,